I'm particularly intrigued this morning as we talk. Your contention that we are in danger of returning to a new feudal system. Probably useful to outline for people who don't really have much of a focus on feudal times, what a feudal system was, and then to perhaps take us through your thinking about why we may be seeing the emergence of a new feudalism, which ought to be deeply concerning to us.
Well, first of all, the feudalism, obviously, it's not the same. It's not people going to go around with chain mail and hack at each other with swords. That we're not going back to that. But what we are seeing is what I would consider the freezing of class lines. In other words, a less and less upward mobility throughout the whole West, and now beginning to affect China as well, where you're pretty much, if you come from a certain class, your chances of staying there are better. The old sort of up from the bottom process has become, which really was characteristic of much of the 20th century, is now much more difficult. And I also think that what you have is one thing is obviously that you have two powerful classes, very much like the old French first and second estates, the aristocracy, which is now the tech and the Wall Street people, and what I call the clerisy, which used to be what we would call the clergy, but is now sort of our secular clergy, the universities, the media, the upper bureaucracy, who can tell us to do whatever we want to do. And in COVID, both of these classes got richer. The people who control the online platforms, obviously Jeff Bezos, have made a phenomenal amount of money in the pandemic. The clerisy has become all powerful, able to determine what's true, what's not, put limitations on almost everything, sometimes with scientific justification, sometimes without, but with an enormous exercise of power. Who has declined? What I call the yeomanry, which would be the old third estate, the small property owners, the artisans, that class. And then below them are what I would call the new serfs, which is very often people who were from the yeoman class, but now have no chance of ever owning a home or starting a business, and are going to be living basically hand to mouth for the rest of their lives. I mean, in certain places, and I think Sydney and Melbourne would be good examples, certainly here in Southern California, in the Bay Area, in the New York City area, the chances of a average earning middle-class family buying a house is very, very small.
Yeah, you draw out some very interesting parallels. You say that this new sort of technical class of very, very wealthy people who do well in this new emerging feudalism, as you put it, has a parallel in China, where it's all right to become incredibly wealthy in a communist state where everybody's meant to be equal, provided you toe the government line, and that there are indeed shades of Mussolini's Italy. You've got the situation where, traditionally in your country and in ours, the captains of industry tended to be economically conservative. They were respecters of democracy. They had a deep identification with their country. But you now see, as David Goodhart might call it, the emergence of the somewheres and the anywheres. The anywheres are sophisticated people who have no particular allegiance or patriotism about them in relation to the country that they live in. And you're seeing this sort of strange merging almost of this pattern in both America and China, as I understand what you're saying.
Well, I think that what's happened in China is that in many ways, I think, what's happening in China, I like to say America is evolving towards Chinese capitalism with American characteristics, sort of turning around Deng Xiaoping's old phrase. Basically, yes, you can make a lot of money, but you've got to kowtow to the party line. So Jeff Bezos gives money to Black Lives Matter, which is a group that, wouldn't mind, seeing him expropriated, if not guillotined. You have people genuflecting to ideologies that are completely opposite to the ideologies that allowed them to accumulate wealth in the first place.
Yep.
And part of what is also very much in the medieval fold is the rise of orthodoxies. In other words, you can't challenge the orthodoxy. You now have Facebook and Google, for instance, limiting and sometimes eliminating points of view that are just dissenters, whether they're um, like, for instance, Steve Koonin, who just wrote a very good book on climate change, a former chief scientist in the energy department under President Obama. He comes out with a book which says, well, there's been a lot of exaggeration and maybe there are more pragmatic ways of doing it. Not a crazy denier's book. It's called misinformation when you try to access it. Or on the most embarrassing things like the whole question of where did COVID come from? I don't know. But the fact that there were credible people who thought that maybe COVID was created in a lab were essentially silenced until the CDC said, "Oh, well, maybe it was true." But in other words, this idea that sort of like you have to go through the bishop's office to get approval for your views. And by the way, when the bishop has a different point of view, that becomes the new law. But meanwhile, anyone who dissents is kicked off, basically, kicked off into what I like to call the digital gulag. I mean, they still exist, they're still breathing, but they have a very hard time reaching anyone.
Yeah, recently in conversation with Yeon-mi Park, the South Korean lady who escaped, a North Korean lady who escaped North Korea, she very vividly describes what a society looks like when all differing views are silenced. You rapidly fall into a great darkness because your ideas are not challenged and the ruling orthodoxy can't be broken. And the results are dreadful in every sense, including economic. But let's tease out a little bit. What does the new clerisy believe? Because this is what you're really touching on when you say that they establish orthodoxies until a new orthodoxy comes along. Which, by the way, sort of takes you right back to the early days of Western freedom, when we used to burn people who dissented at the stake until we realised that was dumb, because sooner or later today's minority would become tomorrow's majority and the whole thing would turn. You get a very unstable situation. But what is it at the moment that the clerisy, the new clerisy as you call them, believe? How would you summarise that?
First of all, they believe in themselves and they are very attached to credentials. I thought one of the great comments about this is, let's say journalism, because I'm particularly sensitive there. You go through the journalism schools, they don't teach people to be objective anymore. They don't teach them, hey, you need to inform the public, which is how I was brought up as a journalist. Now you need to instruct the public. And then you have this belief by, let's say, some of the health authorities, well, we can lie and do things because it's good for people that I lie. Like, I'll change what herd immunity is. I'm going to change whether you should wear a mask or not wear a mask, and then change that point of view with this idea that your authority is so great that nobody can challenge it. And what we have now is a alliance between this clerisy, which is overwhelmingly made up of people who have a particular ideology, and the tech oligarchs, and now the corporate world. The scariest thing in the essay I did recently for Claremont, the scariest thing is now you have major corporations doing the same things. We're going to discriminate against white people. We're going to make sure that our employees go through some sort of indoctrination. United Airlines gets up 50% of our pilots are going to be women or minorities. I said, well, that's great, but you know what? I'm on an airplane a lot, and I really just want a really good pilot. I mean, their skin color and their gender is irrelevant. What I care about is that they're a good pilot. So we're stripping away the merit. And what's ironic about it is many of the victims of this, I'm sure this is going to be true in Australia as well, is you have an Asian population, for instance, which generally overachieves relative to the other ethnic groups overall. And now right? And then you'll say, well, you know what? We don't want the Bronx the Bronx High School of Science or Stuyvesant in New York City or Lowell in San Francisco to be based on merit. These super academic high schools, we're going to do it by lottery. We're going to get rid of any sort of testing. I mean, I can see this. My daughter goes to a charter school here in Orange County, my younger daughter, which is a great school, very hard to get into. They're going to go to a lottery system. And she says to me, Dad, in 5 years, that this degree isn't going to be worth what it was. I know that what's going to happen how good is a Berkeley degree going to be when SATs are no longer used, where the number one way of getting in is basically being in the right ethnic group. You're going to degrade the quality of things, and you're going to make it very difficult, particularly for those people like working class, let's say Asian families who have worked really hard so their kids go to good schools and then they move up. Just like my grandparents coming from Russia were able to get at least some of their kids into the professions and into city college, where they did well. Well, they worked really hard in school. All the habits, what you might call the bourgeois culture, which, by the way, the Black Lives Matter people say it's white culture. It's not white culture. The most bourgeois people I know in terms of behavior are immigrants from Africa. In Houston, the Nigerians, by some measurements, are the best educated, wealthiest population in the city. And so, it's not, but what we've done is we've taken all the elements of middle class value systems and decided that they're racist and discriminatory. And they're the exact opposite. Look, I come from a family where my father was the first one to go to college. For my wife, she was the first one in her immediate family to go to college. I mean, from Canada. All these people who have made this transition, which is the really emblematic of the liberal capitalist era, that whole process is now being negated and turned into something which is very similar to what you saw in China in the 60s or in the former Soviet Union. Except I have to say, in China, they do believe that math is math and engineering is engineering, and 2 + 2 = 4, whatever your race happens to be. And one funny thing is, the craziest thing is my president of my university is a Italian mathematician, and he says they accuse me at math of being racist, and he said, don't they know that this math comes from the Arabs? I mean, he said Roman numerals you could never do calculus with Roman numerals. But we've now taken all the great achievements of our society. And you think about it, why does somebody migrate from China or India to Australia? It's for those very opportunities and freedoms that Australia offers that they can't have at home. And yet we want to rescind those freedoms so that a small ideological group and a group of oligarchs can completely dominate society.
Let's tease that out a bit, because this is where what you say strikes such a chord with me. It is a new aristocracy. Meritocracy is dying. I find that's amazing that it's happened in America, where your great, cat's cry has always been freedom. In Australia, it's always been fairness, I think you'd say. Kim Beazley, former distinguished leader of the other side of politics to me, often says this, and I think he's right. Fairness, Jack's as good as his mate, is a saying that I grew up with. You don't hear it as much now. But now what you actually have that's so frighteningly reminiscent of what we'd once broken free of is a class of people who just naturally assume that they know what is best for us, and they actually don't really believe in democracy. They actually don't really believe in it. They know better.
Well, and where we're going to see this take place is going to be in the climate issue, where they're basically going to say, you're going to have to do what we want, and we know you're not going to like it, so we're going to do everything by administrative diktat. This is the new pattern. Whereas, legislatures are not going to be able to say to people, you know what, we're going to restrict how much energy you can use. We're gonna raise the price of gasoline, petrol by a huge amount, but it's not going to be passed by the legislators. It's going to be done by executive order. We saw this beginning to develop, particularly under President Obama, and now and then Trump basically rescinded them, and now Biden restored them. But in each case, the legislators never got to talk about it. And I want to make one last point just on this, which is I'm not a conservative. I've never been a conservative. I've never voted for a Republican for president. I consider myself somewhat of a social democrat, but today's progressives are the exact opposite of social democrats. Social democrats want middle-class people and working-class people to move up, maybe own property, maybe have a better life for their kids. Today's progressives essentially want everybody to live in a studio apartment, play video games all day, smoke pot, drink, and water their plants, and watch porno. I mean, that's sort of the vision that they have. Their vision isn't this young person's going to achieve what their parents achieved, because under their rubric, you can't address climate change except on the backs of the middle and working class. At the same time that these people live extremely well and violate their own rules, which of course, you might see this in the bishops in medieval Europe.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there, and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.